Go ahead.
All right. All right. Welcome, everybody. It was good we were a little bit late because everyone rolled a little bit late. So welcome. This is the closing keynote to the Connected Learning Summit, which has been running all week. So I just wanted to say a few words just about the Connected Learning Summit. It is sponsored by the Connected Learning Lab, which is a operational research unit here on campus, part of informatics and the School of Ed. If you so want to, you can take a picture of this and answer a survey about just participating in CLS if you did it this week. I wanted to thank the sponsors to the conference this year. We had a bunch of really interesting groups from actually all over the country. The Center for Digital Thriving at Harvard, Connected Learning Alliance, Connected Learning Lab associated with UCI, Utah State, Google, Learning Games Network, Lifelong Kindergarten, and the Scheller Teacher Education Program, both at MIT. Prolepsis, and the Stanford Graduate School of Education. So we really thank the sponsors because the conference obviously could not have gone on without their support. We had a wonderful committee this year that worked hard for more than a year and a half to put the programming together. So we want to have a big thanks to them and also to our staff from the Connected Learning Alliance who have supported the conference all week. If you want to spread the word, doesn't really matter because this is the last day of the conference. The conference happens every 2 years. So you can spread the word for, the next episode coming in 2027. Okay, so we have our, this is also the first speaker in the informatics speaker series and the closing keynote to CLS. So we're very happy to welcome Danaé Metaxa. They're going to talk about some really interesting work they've been doing with young people around kind of sense making around AI. Danaé is the Rajanira Singh Term Assistant Professor of Computer and Information Science at University of Pennsylvania. That's in the School of Engineering and Applied Science. They're a computer scientist in computational social science studying bias and representation in algorithmically mediated content with an emphasis on the experiences of marginalized people. So we're very happy to welcome you. Thank you for being so cool under pressure with our tech problems, but now we're all set up. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, give me 2 more seconds to switch the presentation. Okay, I think everybody can see and hear me. I know everyone in front of me can see and hear me. And hopefully everybody on Zoom can see and hear me if that's not interrupt me soon. Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I am Danaé Metaxa. I'm an assistant professor at UPenn, and I'm new to CLS. I am less new to informatics, a little bit more aware there. And I'm really excited to be talking about some work that's joint with collaborators in education. And I'm calling it AI Literacy for All. And in particular, I'm going to be speaking about our work teaching and learning from youth who audit black box AI systems. And if you don't know what that means, you're still in the right place. This is still a talk for you. So let me take you back briefly to a time when AI was less ubiquitous. I just came here from the Bay Area, actually, and every single billboard is AI related. So it really seems to be it's permeated everywhere. Depending on where you're located, this may be more or less true, but I think for the most part, we're all kind of aware of that. Maybe you remember this sort of scandal of an article from 2014 in which Facebook was, quote unquote, manipulating people's emotions. This was a study that basically showed you more positive content in your newsfeed or more negative content in your newsfeed, and then found that you would then post slightly more positive or more negative content. And there's a lot to unpack here. I won't unpack all of it, obviously some ethical concerns. Putting those sort of briefly aside, I think that this was equally a large shock because most people didn't know that there was an algorithm. In fact, some really great work from the subsequent year did a study in which they showed people sort of how the algorithm might be evaluating their different friendships and why they were seeing more or less content from certain people. And something that these authors found was that more than half of participants were not aware of the newsfeed's existence at all as an algorithmic system. And their initial reactions when they found out that there was an algorithm deciding what they saw were of surprise and anger. This is very different than the world we find ourselves in today. AI is really no longer niche. I think nobody is so surprised at its existence. It's pervasive in our search engines, in our social media, in LLMs now that everybody and their mother is using. It's really just extremely widespread, especially, I would say, generative AI in the last few years. Meanwhile, computing education today looks actually really similar to what it did at the time of that emotional contagion study. I pulled this off of the College Board's website. This is their sample curriculum for AP Computer Science A, and it looks really similar to how it did when I took this class like 15 years ago in high school. And I want to emphasize this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think this really makes sense. It's not like Java programming is no longer relevant. Certainly, learning to program is still super important. But this makes more sense under a worldview in which we're educating people to go on to become programmers, to be working in tech. And for that audience, maybe it's appropriate. But in today's world, I don't think it's enough to just be educating the future programmers about how to use these types of technologies, especially AI. Instead, I think we need to develop ways of preparing all youth to interact with these types of systems because they're surrounded by them in their daily lives. And in particular, we need to prepare them to be users of those systems, not necessarily always creators or programmers. That's good too, but these days I think we need both. So how can we do that? One way that we have explored with some collaborators is by using AI auditing. I'm going to talk first about what AI auditing is, and I'm going to walk you through an example of an audit that I did a few years back. Then I'm going to talk about how we've observed that everyday people are already engaged in these types of behaviors and what we can learn from observing those kinds of sort of in the wild phenomena. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how those insights led us to use auditing as a way of teaching and learning from youth. Okay, so what is auditing? Audits are a technical method for understanding black box AI-powered systems. A system is a black box when it looks kind of like this diagram. Users provide some inputs into the system. We don't know what goes on inside, and then the system produces some outputs. And auditors, what they do is repeatedly query a system with very carefully controlled inputs and then observe the outputs to draw inferences about that system's inner workings, about how it functions. The kinds of questions you might want to ask are like, does Instagram show people different ads based on their race or gender? Or does ChatGPT remember what I told it about myself last week? These are some of the types of questions you might ask. And AI auditing is the term for the kinds of experiments you would run to answer those questions without being an employee of Google or of OpenAI. And importantly, we use audits to evaluate systems with regards to some implicit or explicit standards. These are often related to equity and justice. For example, there are sometimes clear legal requirements, like if Instagram is showing people different ads based on their race, and those ads are for housing, employment, or credit, that's illegal in the United States. They are simply not allowed to do that. And other times these are social expectations. So probably we think that ChatGPT should not give you instructions to make a Molotov cocktail or, encourage other forms of violence. Uh, in some cases, they may be legally liable, but even if they're not, there are some expectations about what content these systems produce. So let me walk you through an example audit to kind of illustrate this in more detail. Some years back in my own group, we did an audit of Google image search, looking at forms of bias and representation. So for example, if you do a Google search for programmer, what does that look like? Google doesn't have some legal obligation to show you certain content in this regard, but it would look pretty bad if it looked something like this. Socially, we know that not all programmers are white or East Asian men, although there is that stereotype. And so we think that that's not really what the real world looks like. And we think that we have the social expectation that it should not reflect a really stereotyped world like this. So how do we go about answering that question? To conduct this audit, the first thing we needed to figure out was what we were going to measure against, like what's the comparison point? And so we pulled data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which publishes demographic information about in the US who does jobs, broadly speaking, a wide range of occupations. And what do those roles actually look like in the US population? And then we were going to compare those to the demographics that we find in image search results. So to do this at scale, we first selected 100 common occupations: programmer, doctor, author, lawyer, and we did Google searches. We actually automated a process to run searches with those as the query terms, and we collected the top 100 images that resulted for each one. Then we crowdsourced race and gender annotations. We asked a bunch of people, who do you perceive to be in this image? Because that's what we're interested in the end. It's this feeling of representation. Do people see certain types of people reflected in those images? And then finally, we compare the diversity that we saw in search to what we see in real life. So skipping a lot of intermediate steps, let's see some results. These data points are all about to move in a second, but let me just tell you how to read this graph. So on the x-axis, we have the proportion of the workforce. In this case, we're looking at gender. So the proportion of the workforce in each of these occupations that is comprised of women. And on the y-axis, I'm going to map each of these data points to the proportion of women we saw in the search results for that occupation. This dashed line is perfect correspondence. If all of the data points were exactly on this line, we would say that Google is reflecting exactly what we see in the real world. And over this line is cases in which women are overrepresented in search. Under the line is cases in which women were being underrepresented in search. Okay, so let's see some data. We see, for example, that receptionists are about 88% women, but almost 100% women in search results. And on the other hand, there are some examples like CEO, which women are about 30% of CEOs in the US, but only 11% of search results. You can see also that bartenders are about 50% women in the real world, but only a quarter of results for that query. And you can see that the weight is sort of a little bit below this line. It's not too far off, but there is sort of a bit of an underrepresentation. It tends in the direction of underrepresentation. We can do the same thing now for race. Again, we have proportion of the workforce that's comprised of people of color on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, what we saw in search results with that line of perfect correspondence diagonally across. You'll notice here that the axes go from 0 to 0.4 because that's the max in terms of POC representation in occupations. The majority is about 40%. And what we see here is, I would say, an even stronger effect. We have shown that also statistically, it is an even stronger effect. We see cases in which there are some cases like librarians where there's a slight overrepresentation of people of color in the search results, but for the most part, take chef. People of color are highly represented in that field at about 40%, but about half of that in search results. And analyzing that data statistically, what we found with this audit was that there was significant underrepresentation of marginalized groups, of women and of people of color, in search results compared to the real world. So that's what an example of an audit looks like in a very brief nutshell. Okay, who conducts audits? You may have heard about these sometimes in the past. Often auditors are researchers or journalists. If you saw the Netflix film Coded Bias, this is the gender shades audit, extremely famous and very impactful, in which researchers Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru identified that face detection systems performed more poorly on darker skinned and more feminine faces. And this is one really good example. Actually, these authors ended up like testifying before Congress. So that was like how impactful this audit was. Audits can take many different forms. One example is a scraping audit, like the first one we saw, in which we did a bunch of these searches in an automated way. We scraped all of the data off of that web page, and then we analyzed it. In other cases, researchers might sort of set up sock puppets or like pose as real users. The gender shades audit is kind of a sock puppet audit because they tested these different photos of people on these systems to see if the detection would work on the photo, as if like instead of bringing in a real person to test that system. And there's a third category of audit that I'm going to go into more deeply, in which users are involved. These are cases maybe where users work with researchers, where users are researchers, but in some form, everyday users are kind of contributing their data or contributing to an audit. So like I said, sometimes researchers and users are actually the same people. In the gender shades audit, Joy Buolamwini found this issue because she was trying to use one of these systems, and she's a Black woman, and it just couldn't detect her face. So this is one way that audits sort of come to be. Sometimes somebody is an expert researcher who also is a user of that system. But other times, auditors are everyday, sort of regular people. Here we have a Twitter user, Tony Abolish Ice Araceli Crab Emoji Rose Emoji, who was identifying, noticed that if you uploaded a photo to Twitter's newsfeed, the newsfeed would sort of crop that image to fit in the newsfeed better, and that it seemed to have a preference for white faces when it was doing that cropping. This was something that happened a few years ago. A lot of users started noticing this pattern. Kind of one person first noticed it, others saw that tweet and started trying it out for themselves. And in this case, I mean, Tony can correct me if I'm wrong, but in this case, most of the people involved were not experts. They were just everyday users of that system who noticed the problem and then started trying to identify and diagnose it better. So these cases where everyday users are involved are called everyday audits. These are cases in which everyday users of algorithmic systems detect and raise awareness about harmful behaviors that they encounter in the course of their everyday interactions with those systems. And while we're here, I want to call your attention to this piece about harmful behaviors, about harm. In canonical auditing literature, audits are focused on uncovering harm and on uncovering problems. But just hold on to that piece because I think it becomes a little bit more complex and more interesting in a minute. Okay, so having learned what auditing is, let me tell you about one really interesting case study we did that opened our minds to kind of the possibilities of what could happen when everyday people are engaged in auditing. If you're not familiar with TikTok and the platform's generative AI filters, TikTok uses an image-to-image generative AI model, which will do various things. Sort of everyday people, users can design different filters and then deploy them on the platform. And the AI manga filter was one that got really, really popular a couple of years ago. I'm talking like millions of people using this filter, making videos on TikTok. As you can imagine from the name, it takes some input image, it processes that image, and then it spits out a sort of AI manga style depiction of the input image. In this case, you see my cat, his name is Carl, and we can see how he has become AI mangified by this filter. So we observed in my research group, many of us are social media users, and we started noticing that at the time that this filter really blew up, people started identifying the same patterns, the same sort of weird behavior from this filter. So one thing people commonly noticed was like, here is an empty hallway, but where did this person come from? They would run the filter and suddenly there would be a person in the image. This led people to speculate that maybe these were ghosts. This was kind of something that was drawing a lot of attention. Other times they would upload like an image. This is my PhD student, Ro. This is Ro's face. And this is definitely not Ro's face. What's going on there? To study this phenomenon, not just what was going on, but actually how people were observing what was going on, we qualitatively coded. We collected first about 400 videos using this filter. We coded them for things like what action the user was taking, what they were doing to prompt the system, what the outcome was, like what pattern was being observed, whether the user was identifying this as part of an explicit trend that other people were doing too, and also what the emotions were of the person having that experience who had uploaded this video. Did they seem surprised? Did they seem angry? Did they seem pleased? And we came up with 8 major themes. I'm going to touch on 3 of them today. So what were users finding? The first thing they identified was this anthropomorphization thing, right? So you would upload some photo that did not have a person, and the filter would process it and spit out a photo that did have a person. Harmless enough, but still kind of weird and not the expected behavior of that system. More in line with traditional auditing, people also identified race and gender bias. Here's an example again. This is Ro's face. Ro is Afro-Latina, and this doesn't even look like her. And a lot of users, especially people of color, were noticing this sort of lightening and racialized sort of whitening effect. Trans users also noticed this. This is one very popular trans creator, and she tried using this filter a bunch of times and just couldn't get it to not misgender her. These are the kinds of things that expert auditors study all the time. These are the sort of things that we might expect would be a problem with these types of systems. But it's really cool to see that everyday people were identifying these things and exploring them themselves. Moving on from that to something a little more light, the third thing we saw users noticing very commonly was this sexualization trope. So, again, here's that first example we saw, Rose face, not Rose face. And you can also see that the racialization thing here is happening at the same time. So often multiple of these patterns were co-occurring. Now, the interesting thing here was that users actually went to great lengths to try to solicit this type of result. They were really trying to push the boundaries of the system. This resulted in trends where users would identify some particular pattern of behavior, some way that they could alter their inputs to get a desired output, like this fist trend. You can see what happens. Or in other cases, maybe drawing lines on their stomach to get this like six-pack effect. And this was something that this was really common in our data set. We saw a lot of this type of behavior. So these are three of the things that we saw users collectively experimenting with and identifying in the course of their use of the AI manga filter. As researchers, we were also using this as an opportunity to reflect on kind of a meta level about what all of this means. The first important note is that AI impacts were really complex. We saw a lot of cases in which people were frustrated and annoyed, especially when they were repeatedly sort of fighting with the filter to try to get some output and they just couldn't make it happen. This was the most true in our data set for people of color and for trans users who just didn't find themselves able to be represented by this tool. And this tracks really well with the definition, right? Remember this piece about harmful behavior? These are the type of things that expert auditors have long focused on. And in fact, if you had just shown me this video, this filter tool without any other background, this is probably the first thing I would have looked for. But we also saw a lot of evidence, in fact, in the majority of cases, in which people were happy or satisfied with the result, sometimes even when problematic things were happening. So you can see this user who was trying for a while to get the filter to render her hair texture correctly, and she managed to achieve that with this particular photo. And although you can see that it does lighten her skin, it changes her features, it gives her blue eyes, at the same time, her overall feeling is one of satisfaction. She's like, yeah, I actually like what happened here. I like the output. And building on that, we found that users really found these types of patterns to be fun and they found it to be sort of funny. They were motivated to try tests in that spirit of fun. So here's somebody testing it on the Tapatio hot sauce bottle, very creative idea of an input. And in the words of one commenter, this went from Tapatio to Tapapapi. These were the sorts of videos that, clearly indicated that people were having fun with this in a lot of cases. And going along with that, in the spirit and motivation of sort of fun, we saw users engaging playfully and creatively. They would try wearing different costumes or wearing their own clothes in really unusual ways, trying different body positions, putting a towel on their head to sort of mimic having long hair, um, and, using different household items as props. And we found that these were actually really effective. They learned more about the algorithm because they were trying these sort of wacky, outside of the box strategies. So these were three of the main things that we observed as researchers in this case study. And a lot of that goes against what experts have believed about audits, or at least how we've conceptualized them this far. In fact, we found that auditing can be fun, it can be creative, and it happens organically. People are just engaged in this way naturally. So we noticed that people were motivated by fun and play. We noticed that users, especially including youth who make up a large portion of the Tech Talk user base, were already independently engaged in these types of queries. And also we noticed that this type of engagement can be low or no coding. In this case, they just needed to be users of the platform. This was a really accessible thing to do. So that brings us to this third piece of work that's sort of the major point of this talk. And this is work that I've done jointly with scholars in education, teaching and learning from youth auditors. So essentially, we identified that audits, especially the kinds that were already being conducted by everyday users, and especially using tools that they already knew and cared about, were a really good opportunity to prepare youth to learn about and to interrogate AI systems. There are three pieces here. The first is teaching youth to audit. The second is teaching teachers, both youth teaching teachers, us teaching teachers, teachers teaching all of us. And finally, actually, I think there are some really key ways here in which we can inform the field of AI auditing based on what we have learned by bringing it to a larger audience. So let's begin with this first one. We've done this work over the last 2 years in a series of phases. In the first, we worked with local area youth, talking to them about their existing auditing practices. In the second phase, we piloted AI auditing activities through a series of 5 steps that I'll talk about, and we ran those activities with youth. And then in the third phase, we're working with teachers and learners at the same time to design and deploy these types of activities. I'll be talking mostly about the second 2 phases. So in the first, in a series of workshops that we ran in 2024, we had youth first design and audit each other's filters, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We then had them do a collaborative audit all together as a group. And then our research team kind of evaluated the outputs of that audit, understanding both how they had done it, what choices they were making, whether it seemed like their conclusions sort of agreed with what we would see, and overall understanding whether this was an effective sort of learning strategy. Our participants here were 14 scholars at a local science center. They were ages 13 to 15, so high schoolers, gender and racially diverse from predominantly underrepresented in STEM backgrounds. And this was a 2-week summer program. We actually ran a series of workshops in the spring and then a 2-week summer program in the summer. So we've seen that these filters exist, these types of AI filters exist on TikTok. Something you might not know is that TikTok has a platform for creating these types of filters, and it's called Effect House. So the central idea in Effect House is that you can easily set up a flow without much coding in which you provide a text prompt and an input image, and Effect House will use its generative AI model to re-render that input image to illustrate it according to the prompt you provided. Here are a couple of examples brainstormed by students. If you prompt it with tennis player and you give it this input image, this is what results. If you use basketball player as the prompt, you see a pretty different result. I won't spoil it, but we're about to get to, maybe this looks a little familiar. And now in order to turn auditing, which can be sort of a open-ended, nebulous process, into something that was concrete enough that we could teach it effectively to young people, our research team spent a bunch of time trying to understand how we could decompose auditing into a set of steps. And what we came up with was this series of 5 steps. In the first, you have to generate a hypothesis. In the second, you have to select systematic, thorough inputs to test that hypothesis. In the third, you run those tests. Fourth, you analyze the data. And fifth, you report the findings. So I'm going to clarify these 5 steps by sort of briefly rerunning that very first audit we saw, breaking it out into these steps. So in our first study, the hypothesis was that image search results would display race and gender biases compared to workforce demographics. We selected these systematic and thorough inputs by collecting 100 common occupations and 100 images for each of them. Then to run the tests, we crowdsourced the annotations to evaluate who was in those images and compare that against our ground truth. Fourth, we analyzed the data. We did this with statistics. And then fifth, we reported the findings. And like many academic efforts, we did this by publishing a paper. We also did this by trying to talk to Google, and I will let you guess how interested they were in hearing about this issue. Okay, so turning to our youth audit, here's how we walked the youth through this set of steps and what they did at each step. They did all of this kind of guided by our facilitation, but also their own interests and creativity, with an emphasis, as we sort of expected, on fun and play, as well as structure and systematicity. So first, we worked with the whole group to generate a hypothesis about what they could investigate in Effect House, based on their prior experiences playing with Effect House and also on their own personal experiences. Some of their ideas included maybe the images need to be right side up in order for the filter to work right. Or maybe the filter will change the color of clothing people are wearing. Or maybe it doesn't render animals correctly and it'll like change a dog into a cat. One team of youth, who we had them sort of broken up into teams, started experimenting with prompts that rendered athletes. You know, they started giving a prompt that was like scuba diver, tennis player, basketball player. And one of them, Kaden, observed that when I put tennis player, it made her white, but basketball player made her black. And this was sort of the key insight that the other students started to sort of play with and gravitate around. And without being directed to, they kind of came to this occupation idea, which is extremely cool for me, having done that other audit. And so they kind of came together and decided to audit for this hypothesis that Effect House's image model reinforces gender and race stereotypes about occupations. This is not exactly the same as the previous study in which we were looking at comparison with the workforce, but it's a really similar idea, right? And it was pretty cool to see them be like interested in this question. So next, we guided the students to select systematic and thorough inputs that would cover a large space. These included tattoo artist, president of the US, rapper, senator, nail technician. Um, they came up with these sort of drawing on their own experiences. One student thought of nurses because my mom and all her friends are nurses, so maybe these images will look like my mom and her friends. Or one student said, rapper makes me think of black men, specifically Tupac. Shout out to Tupac. And so based on their own interests and their own ideas, that's how they selected this set of occupations. In doing so, they were also having, it was really cool to see that they were having conversations about racism and sexism. So one student said, for instance, oh, chef is going to look white because most chefs are white and European. But as we actually already know from this talk, that's not necessarily the case. Another student pointed out that maybe chef and cook would behave differently because those are the same job, but one is more associated with men and one with women. So it's very cool to see the ways that this sort of had them bring in their own existing knowledge and be thinking about bigger concepts. The other piece we needed here were a starting set of input images. And so we provided them with this set of 12 inputs that cover a range of gender and racial identity and presentation. Now, then to run the talks, the youth broke up this data set and they ran each of these 12 input images through Effect House with each prompt, noticing patterns as they went. This resulted in a really large spreadsheet. They could notice in this spreadsheet, you can look at trends based on the same image by looking column-wise or by the same prompt looking row-wise. And doing this collectively across the whole group and sort of breaking up the task amongst themselves enabled scale. They were able to collectively generate 1,200 output images. And despite this sort of maybe the tediousness of running these tasks, we found that they were engaged and focused. They were thinking through their analysis as they went, and they were really taking it one step at a time. They also sometimes were guided by their own curiosity to explore other avenues, thinking like, what happens if I use my own name as a prompt? What types of people come out? The next piece was analysis. So teens analyzed in 6 small breakout groups of 2 to 3 people. Within those groups, in total, they selected 13 of these occupations to focus on. And there were a lot of different modes of analysis. They were qualitatively labeling these images, sometimes with a sort of open-ended description, other times by counting the presence or absence of some attribute, sometimes trying to focus on really firm observable characteristics, maybe assigning a score in other cases of, you know, how masculine to how feminine does this output image look on a scale of 1 to 10. And the coolest part for me here is that although the hypothesis was about race and gender, 5 out of the 6 groups also noticed and started analyzing for age. That's super fascinating because this is something that's obviously extremely relevant to them as young people. In fact, like this is maybe the main axis of their oppression in society. And it was something that was relevant and interesting to them that they noticed and they started analyzing. And it's not a common attribute for experts. Overall, their findings included things like that nail technicians, one group said appeared female, or another group said had makeup, different ways of measuring a similar concept. Priests looked 100% male compared to 50% of the inputs. This is a case in which a group sort of naturally gravitated towards doing a comparison with some kind of ground truth, which is cool. In terms of race, a group noticed that senators all had white aesthetics, clarifying that this meant blue eyes and blonde hair. And in terms of age, they noticed that presidents all looked older and the filter added wrinkles and gray hair. And then to have them report these findings, we did not make them write an academic paper. We did that, but we had them make TikTok videos or find other ways that felt engaging and interesting to them to present those results. Now, anybody who's seen like a conspiracy theorist online talk about how they've done their own research knows that these types of user-centered explorations can sometimes go awry. And something we were interested in was sort of how much do these results hold up? Do they track with what we would analyze in those images ourselves? So we asked, did this workshop support them to reach evidence-based and credible conclusions in doing this audit? And to understand that, we qualitatively coded the same data set on those same axes. We found high agreement between researchers and youth, and our takeaway here is that youth can audit. These types of strategies, these scaffolded participatory design activities, guided teens to accurately and empirically evaluate this AI system. We found also that it was fun and engaging for them to do that, and that they identified biases like age that experts often overlook, in addition, of course, to biases that experts are more attuned to. So now that we know these activities can be effective, how do we spread them further? Briefly, especially briefly because we started late, I'm going to talk about a little bit of our work developing educational materials for teaching teachers to teach youth, for youth to teach teachers, and for teachers to teach other teachers. This was sort of the third phase of our audit here. And so beginning last summer, we brought teachers in for a workshop, a series of meetings in which we first had preparatory meetings with them. Then teens came in and acted as advisors to the teachers. And then the teachers worked on lesson design sessions. We brought in 6 teachers who we trusted a lot and had an extensive backstory working with. I say we, but this is really because I have phenomenal collaborators who have really long-standing relationships with a number of teachers across the country who we were able to bring in to work with us. And we also brought in 3 of the teens that we had worked with in the previous series of workshops to serve as advisors, really emphasizing the expertise that they have. They really are more experts than the adults on this. So the workshop proceeded as follows. First, we reviewed teens' work from earlier workshops. Then teachers presented their own audit projects and teens provided constructive feedback about them. And then finally, we had open discussion altogether about lesson ideas and reflections. And in doing this, we found that teens shared a number of important insights with teachers. This included their everyday expertise. They really are experts at using this tool and at using their smartphones, and constructive feedback on the auditing project, saying like, oh, if you're not consistent about the lighting, or if you hold your phone at that angle, the filter's not going to work as well. They were also a great source of information about their own interests and their peers' interests. So they could give feedback on teachers' lesson ideas, like, would it be more interesting to audit Spotify radio or Amazon shopping recs? And to give their own perspectives on auditing. And they could also describe the impacts that these auditing activities had had on them, including that it's shifted their perspectives on algorithmic systems, and that it, in some cases, changed the way that they interacted with AI moving forward. So one teen described, when you use TikTok, you don't really think about it. But when you sit down and really analyze it, you realize how important it is. Something that really emphasized that came away to this student, Nadine, was that, TikTok was something that she was used to people telling her was a waste of her time and she shouldn't be thinking about it or doing it. And that instead, through this process, she was able to recognize her own expertise and that there was something interesting going on in a tool she was using every day. And teachers noticed that this really allowed students to go from becoming passive users of technology to thinking about it more, questioning it a little bit, taking a more critical stance towards these technologies. This would have been a much longer section if we had not had this teacher and youth grant terminated by NSF this spring. So if anybody knows anybody at NSF these days, we do still plan, though, to continue doing this research. So, for example, by teachers teaching teachers, working with a group of teachers to develop these types of materials, deploy them in their real public school classrooms, and then have them, through professional development, teach other teachers to reach a larger number of students over the course of the next few years. And the last thing I want to touch on is how all of these experiences can actually inform and grow expert or professional conceptions of AI auditing as well. So going back to fun and play, this was the first thing we saw, right? It expands our knowledge of the field and of professional practices. This sort of fun and play angle was not something that was really well understood or extensively described, much at all, really. In fact, part of the reason this paper is still under review is that reviewers they didn't really like it. Um, but I think this is the real world. This is what's going on. And if we want to bring everyday people into auditing, if we want to do, as experts, if we want to do collaborative audits with people where they feel motivated and excited to participate and help us, we're going to have to understand what motivates those people. And in many cases, it's not just, our own focus on equity and justice, but also along with that, fun, play, and creativity. Also, in 2021, I wrote the first short book with some collaborators on AI auditing. And in that book, there are something like 12 different dimensions of audits. I mean, in fairness, it was a bit of a more professional audience. That's what I tell myself anyway. But this was a really complex, maybe overly complex way of thinking about it. And I think our 5 steps are a much cleaner framework that we came to in search of educational scaffolding when we were really focused on how can we better convey and educate others about this, which is technically the point of a book. So, along with a really, really excellent team of co-authors, we have a forthcoming general audience book from the MIT Essential Knowledge series. And in that book, we actually do use these 5 steps to really walk a general audience through what it means to do an audit. So we found that AI auditing with youth has been really fruitful and effective, both in education and computing. What else can we do? What's next? Okay, the first thing, obviously, we can expand these materials, expand auditing, teaching, expand the materials we have and make them more widely available. But I also wonder what other relevant strategies we have in computing, like red teaming or crowdsourcing, that we could also similarly use to engage youth. And finally, I think in doing so, what we've observed is that we will evolve these professional methods in response to what we learn from everyday users and from young people. So this is our overall goal here. We think that by connecting professional practices with teaching and learning, this will help us prepare youth to navigate, understand, and critically evaluate AI systems in ways that they find fun, creative, and engaging. Before I go, if I haven't said it enough, I need to underscore that this work is a really interdisciplinary group effort. So huge credit and thanks to everyone that has been involved in this work. And thanks also to CLS and to Informatics for inviting me. For a list of the papers that I referenced in this talk, you can see my website, metaxa.net/CLS, and I'm happy to take questions.
Getting some animated clouding. All right, yes, any questions? We'll take questions in the room first, and then on chat, if you all have questions, raise your hand. I'll call on you, or you can just put it in chat. Any questions, comments? Yes, Paul.
So I've got 2 questions. I'll just give you both of them. You can choose how you want to deal with one and the other or both. So one of them is I was thinking of Shannon Ballard's notion of the AI mirror. This idea about what AI reveals about the society that produced the AI.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, in your experiments, how you have helped people to sort of interpret questions of the source of the bias and whether this is about AI at all. I mean, the idea that manga has highly sexualized images, I don't think is a shock. Nor indeed do I think it's from the filter.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you help people navigate.
Yeah.
I suppose. And then the other question is about the term AI literacy, which you didn't use in your talk. And so I'm wondering if what you've learned about the sort of the politics of that term, because it brings up these questions of whose responsibility is it to deal with these kinds of challenges. And I've normally heard the term or encountered the term AI literacy used by technical AI people largely to sort of shame people who don't know enough about AI and therefore, not sort of responding the way they.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So the first question, to repeat it for Zoom, was about how do we identify what the source of these issues is?
Yeah, or
How do you guide people towards? Yeah, and the second one about the term AI literacy. So yeah, in terms of that first piece, well, okay, maybe based on the idea you have of manga, it's not a shock that there's sort of highly sexualized imagery, but that's not true of all manga. There are different genres. I learned this from one of our grad students who knows way more about this than I do, but I have learned that there are different genres of manga and they're often targeted towards different audiences, like for young girls, much less sexualized, maybe the kinds that we see more often in the West, sort of the opposite. And so so this was something that came up in our workshops, and actually in some cases youth also know more about this than we do, and they're able to identify that there are different sources that they could have drawn on to train this filter that would behave differently. The other thing that was interesting was that youth did find that if they were more specific in the prompts that they gave, they could sort of steer the filter to do more or less, in fact, some cases more biases, and some cases less. So for example, there was like a Black women empowerment filter that a group came up with where the intention was specifically to
Can you stop screen share real quick?
to make the output image look black. But in other cases, they didn't want that to happen consistently. And they did find that by giving more specific prompts, they could steer the behavior more, which actually led them to the conclusion that there was room for agency by the filter designer. They often came in with the expectation that like, oh, the filter is just janky or it just doesn't work. And they found in working with, I didn't really talk about this in the talk, but in making their own filters, that maybe there was more responsibility on the creator of that filter, the designer of the filter, than they had previously thought. So I think the hands-on exploration really helped them start to tease those things apart, as well as like their own background knowledge about like AI and manga. The second piece around literacy, okay, I got to admit, I'm still pretty new to this field, and if this is the wrong term to use, I totally will own that. Um, I think that who the responsibility is for teaching youth, I guess teaching implies that we are already decided it's going to happen through education. But anyway, whose responsibility is for youth to be able to use AI? I think it's really on all of us. The youth are already out there doing it. They're excited, they're engaged, they are questioning these systems. Um, and as much as I don't like what Silicon Valley, often how they go about things in Silicon Valley, I don't think that there's necessarily that they have expertise in education, that they're even thinking in many cases about youth users of the platform. I think it's certainly their responsibility. At the same time, there are so many opportunities for all of the rest of us to do something. And I think we owe it to youth who are more than doing their own part already. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna take a question from Mimi from chat. Yeah, sorry. She says, I'd love to hear more about what you've learned about what brings educators into this work. What are the learning outcomes they're oriented to? What context and subjects are they working in?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we were working with high school, mostly computer science teachers, and well, I suppose there's a big selection bias in terms of the people we've worked with. These are folks who have been engaged with research for a long time, who have done these types of curricular development and deployment in classrooms for other types of activities before in the past. So I don't know necessarily that will generalize to like a wider sample of all teachers. But I certainly found that the teachers that we've worked, oh, there's an echo in the room. Okay. I certainly have found that the teachers that we've worked with, they're not new to this. Like this is the sort of stuff that they've been doing for a long time. They're really interested in improving their own teaching, in connecting with their students, in better understanding AI themselves. Like through the process of doing this learning, they are also learning. yeah, I don't know. I hope maybe that answers the question a bit.
Okay. I'm gonna have to do one follow-up from Zoom and then you can ask here, so think about your questions, students in my 209S, think about your questions. So Yuri, who's working in Brazil, he asked, wonderful perspective, would you be willing to expand the scope and experiment teaching teachers outside the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is like a feature of who we have connections with existing, pre-existing, but if you have connections with teachers in other places, definitely reach out. I think we're very interested in expanding this beyond the US. Yeah.
Email Danaé about that.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
What do you think happens after the auditing? Because it seems like step 5 and the endpoint is sharing the results. What do you, like regarding like becoming AI literate or taking some agency apart from just tweaking the filter? What do you think happens after you already know like, oh, it seems like there's a ingrained bias in this filter or in this algorithm? What do you think youth can do next? How can they redress this issue?
Yeah. One of the biggest limitations of auditing as a field is that it helps you to diagnose problems, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to fix them, nor does it necessarily make those fixes possible, even if you have those ideas. Certainly what we saw was that youth were approaching AI systems differently. They were more critical, they felt more able to experiment and to probe these systems in a systematic way. Like it seems like it taught them, as it has taught us, I think, who do audits, to be systematic and to be critical and to be probing. It doesn't necessarily fix the problem. So I think what youth can do, like what it provides them is the ability to move forward and be more fluent and effective users of those technologies, to know maybe how to attribute harm, to know that it is also on the filter designer and not just on the generative AI, not just on the data set. This is sort of a popular conception. I think often when we talk about AI bias, everybody's like, oh, the data set. It's not just the data set. And in doing these types of activities, youth were able to understand that in a sort of lived way that let them translate those experiences to other systems they were working with. But I do still, I'm interested in and always kind of hungry for opportunities to change something, to provide a different system, to provide some alternative, to find some way to push back. In some of my other work, we do research in my group on targeted advertising. And in addition to studying biases in it, we have a project recently in which we are giving people tools to sort of collaboratively filter and change the ads that they see. And so I'm really interested in these types of intervention points also, where like maybe we can build something or do something that improves materially the circumstances in which people are operating. But when we can't do that, something we can do is to teach people better to understand those things and evaluate them critically.
There's one suggestion on Zoom that said maybe you might think about creating an AI auditing game in order to reach a wider audience.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I have a very lovely student group that have graduated, and so I may never see them again, who were working on a website for running these types of activities. Um, I'm interested in kind of pushing that forward, especially because something we ran into talking to teachers is that like TikTok is not allowed in most of their classrooms. So these activities that we could do in an after school setting, they have to be translated in some way to work in schools.
Right, yeah, Roderick, and then we'll come back.
Thanks again for the talk. It was great. I think also the part that like students discover, you've discovered a form, we're interested in age and kind of age discrimination or representations of age. That's super exciting. I have 2 questions. The first one, what students get for participating?
What did they get for participating?
Yeah, like how were they compensated for their participation?
Oh yeah. We like bought them lunch on a few days. They are part of this. The more important thing is that this is a STEM Scholars program that is like a long running thing that they participate in through high school. And it provides them with, it's run out of the Science Museum. It provides them with sort of like, advising and college prep and a bunch of other stuff in addition to like participating in these studies with us. I actually today got an email from a 4th-year PhD student at Northeastern who wrote to me asking like, hey, I heard about you through the director of the STEM Scholars program because when I was in high school, I was a STEM scholar and like, can we have a meeting to talk about my research? Which was that was like, a few hours ago. It's a cool full circle moment for me. So we did like, work with them through this wider program that I think gives them a lot more structure and like support.
Yeah, that's cool. I think I want to ask Paul's question again, but I'm not sure if it's
Yeah.
Paul's question, but at the start, we're looking at like, broadly speaking, we're looking at the politics of representation.
Yeah.
Right? And so we can presume that particular kinds of image searches or search for jobs, they will skew male, white, and cis, the more prestige is attached to whatever the thing you're searching for is, right?
Yes.
Presume that ahead of time. So I guess the audit gives some kind of measurement, but it's, when I was thinking to work with the students, I was just thinking, it's like, are you sure representation is what you're working on? Because are you also, or shouldn't the students somehow be addressing racism, sexism, and transphobia rather than representation? The presidents are not, all the presidents are old white men, except for the ones that were in their 40s and the one that was black. So when they look for presidents and are returned images of old white men, I guess I feel cautious that we would describe that as a kind of bias in representation rather than a bias in the distribution of the presidency.
Yeah, that is so fair. That's why in the end, the first audit that I did there is comparison against workforce demographics. And although like the youth's audit was not with that explicit hypothesis about comparing against some sort of ground truth vision of the world, we did see that these were exactly the kinds of conversations they were having. They're like, is it gonna be, are we gonna see that chefs are male and cooks are female, even though it's the same job? Because one of those has a stereotype of being associated with women or with men because one of them is higher prestige than the other. Yeah, these were like exactly the types of concepts that they were engaging in. I don't know that representation was a word that like we used with them. These are fundamentally social biases and isms. But I do think it was really, those were the kinds of conversations that were being facilitated. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Right, time for one more question. It's kind of in the back, yeah. I guess like focused on TikTok, do you have implications for like other social platforms or the ways that these filters might differ across them?
Yeah, that's a great, so the question for Zoom was that we focus on TikTok and are there sort of other social platforms as well? Yeah, I mean, we can look at generative AI in a bunch of other settings as well, because it's everywhere now and really integrated into a lot of different systems. As well as our teachers were coming up with other ideas, like I mentioned, like Spotify recommendations or like Amazon shopping recommendations. And there's a wide range of other types of sort of black box AI that people use all the time that we can also investigate. Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for coming. We have refreshments out on the terrace, so please join us and Danaé out there can continue the conversation. And we have our own elders in a couple of weeks. So I hope to see everyone back for that on the 24th. So thank you to everyone on Zoom.